Okay, I'll say a few words very quick by way of introduction. My name is Dickson and I work at the Transnational Law Institute at King's College. And we have all been shaken tremendously by what happened on June 23rd. And so this lecture series that we're starting now continues a little tradition that we've had, where we bring renowned scholars or practitioners, experts from a range of fields to the Institute to explore for us and with us challenges, broadly speaking, in global governance, but to do so with particular intellectual rigor, critical mind, and fresh eyes. And so before my colleague, postdoctoral research fellow Dr. Lilian Nguyen, who works with us here at the Institute on a project on labor law in the global supply chain, will say a few words about our first speaker. Let me just take half a minute to read you the caption about the lecture series that we have placed online, to give you an idea of why we created this lecture series and who we had in mind to speak to us. We have called the lecture series Contesting Globalization Post-Brexit, Examining Transnationalization, Capitalism and Democracy in a Global Age. The Brexit vote on 23 June 2016 and the spectre of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union have been labelled as one of the most momentous historical events in centuries. Its constitutional dimension is being debated far beyond the country's borders, but so are the vote's even deeper causes and origins. While some point to the growing frustration of UK citizens over an alleged loss of sovereignty, which is said to manifest itself in immigration numbers and herewith associated fiscal and economic burdens, others argue for a much wider view. From that perspective, Brexit has to be seen as an outcry against conditions of economic and political marginalization and a state of precariousness in which the 99% find itself today, in the UK and well beyond. Brexit then becomes an illustration of globalization and its discontent. A long overdue, and looking at the manifestations of public outcry in Greece, Spain and elsewhere, an event less surprising than the post-vote news had made it out to be. So now I hand over to my colleague, Dr. Nguyen, who will say a few words about our first wonderful speaker. Thank you so much for coming. And no, go ahead, come on. Run through the cameras, we all have to do that. And there's one seat in the back and one seat in the front. Okay, that's good. I'll sit here.
When I was asked, or rather instructed, to present the speaker a few days ago, I was petrified, understandably so. I heard somewhere that the normal practice is for the person who introduces the speaker to be more distinguished than the speaker. And Professor Geisler didn't know where I took that quote from. It was from his colleague who introduced him during his inaugural lecture at the SOAS, School of Oriental and Asian Studies at the University of London in 2013. But I must say, regardless, it's a privilege for me to be here today to introduce Professor Geisler, who earned his PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge, but is now serving as research professor and former professor of development studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Professor Geisler has held chairs at the universities of Bath and Monash in Australia. He has also worked in various positions at the International Labour Organization, including 7 years as director of the Socio-Economic Security Program, and also was coordinator and main writer of the ILO's Economic Security for a Better World. That's a global report that was published in 2004. Professor Standing has extensive NGO experience and also long-standing experience as as a consultant for governments and various international bodies in the UK, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Needless to say that he has various... Needless to say that Professor Guy Standing is author of several books, including the widely received books on the notion of the Precariat, a notion that he has pushed us to understand not as typical blue-collar workers, but has really extended it to various groups. But that's just what Professor Standing does. He pushes us to always take a critical look at various phenomena that we are experiencing. And he does the same in the latest book, which is one of 7 that he has authored so far. The latest book on the corruption of capitalism, which for people like myself who are just beginning to understand what is happening, is a masterful analysis, really, of global capitalism and of how it is rigged in favor of rentiers who restrict the supply of competition and competitors, erode labor laws, and deprive workers, what we may call workers, but Professor Standing would like to think of them as taskers, of benefits and basic rights, including the right to unionize. So I look forward to the discussion, and especially to how Professor Standing would like us to think of the effect of Brexit, which is where the book ends. So perhaps we could take the discussion in the next hour. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very nice introduction. I got to the stage where I want to pay the person doing the introduction not to go into detail, because it makes me sound old, you know, you get to that stage. So, but thank you very much. This book is really the third in a trilogy. And the trilogy began with the Precariat in 2011, A New Dangerous Class. That book's been translated into 19 languages, it's gone viral. As an academic, you never expect that sort of thing, I promise you. And I've been asked to talk about it in 400 places in 37 countries. That doesn't happen, okay? But it's happened. And it's an extraordinary thing because every single day I get emails and contacts from people who want to tell me their story about being in the Precariat. And it's a reality which is a very painful one. And I thought I'd go into this last of the trilogy in a different way. But it's very interesting. I'm an economist, and I thought as I was coming here that I should begin by saying that every good economics book, and there are not many around, but every good economics book should begin with a nightmare and end with a dream. And this is essentially what I've tried to do in this book. Now, briefly, let me tell you a bit of the background, the context. I know most of you are not economists, but I'll try and give the economic context. Essentially, we're in the midst of a global transformation. Analogous to Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation, except this is about the painful construction of a global market system, whereas Polanyi was talking about national market systems. A disembedded phase followed by a re-embedded phase, which is the welfare states. We're in the midst of a global transformation, and as with Polanyi's Great Transformation, the first phase has been dominated by financial capital, pursuing the interests of financial capital, and has been implemented an ideological paradigm, which we now call neoliberalism, which has essentially been about the liberalization of all markets, but that's not the same thing as free markets. The liberalization on certain conditions in the interests of certain interests. And it's been about the commodification of everything that can be commodified and the privatization of everything that can be privatized, including the dismantling of all institutions of social solidarity. Why? Because they stand against the market. Institutions of solidarity stand against the market, and therefore have to go in their ideology. And what has happened is that this sort of neoliberal phase has gone along with a technological revolution, which is a silicon revolution, as we all know, which has been very disruptive. But the fundamental aspect of it is not that the robots are going to take all our jobs, but it's a disruptive in the sense that it's changing the power relations and facilitating a global labour market, a global labour process taking shape. That's the key point for my narrative. Okay? And then you go to the realization that what we're witnessing and experiencing is a globalizing labour process in which the world's labour supply has quadrupled, virtually. Because in the last 25, 30 years or so, an extra 2 billion people have become part of the global labour market. And of course, that has put huge downward pressure on wages in OECD countries, huge downward pressure, especially as productivity can be rising dramatically fast in emerging market economies like China and India and so on. Okay? So that's a contextual point, but it's weakening of the power of labour and the power of ordinary people vis-à-vis the state and vis-à-vis multinational capital. It's a critical background thing. Now, in the process, and I'm flashing through these points very quickly because I want to get to the narrative of this book, but I think it's important for those who aren't familiar with the Precariat dialogue, we're seeing a global class structure taking shape. And that global class structure is a plutocracy up here, an elite, salariat shrinking, all the old labour laws and things applying to them, a shrinking proletariat, and the precariat underneath is not an underclass. The underclass exists, it's out in the streets. But global capital wants a precariat. What does it consist of? It consists fundamentally of millions of people who are being defined by 3 dimensions. First dimension is distinctive relations of production. And that means they're being habituated to accept a life of unstable labour and unstable living without an occupational identity and narrative to give to their lives. The precariat also has to do a hell of a lot of work for labour and work for the state, for which they don't get remunerated, it doesn't get recognised in labour law, it doesn't get recognised in our statistics, which are unfit for purpose. But if you're in the precariat, you have to do a hell of a lot of work just to survive. I won't go into that detail. The books document that and describe the different forms. In addition, the precariat is unique historically because this is the first emerging class whose level of education is above the level of labour they can be expecting to get. Very distinctive features, never existed before. The second dimension, which is also distinctive, is that the precariat has to rely almost entirely on money wages. It doesn't get access to non-wage benefits that constituted the emerging form of labour decommodification in the 20th century, where more and more of the remuneration went into non-wage benefits, your pensions, your paid holidays, your medical leave, your paternity leave, your whatever, that sort of stuff. They don't get any of that. So that puts them in tension with the proletariat and the salariat, of course. And in addition, the precariat is finding that its real wages, the value of their wages that they can expect to get, have been stagnant for 30 years. In Germany, the United States, Britain, France, you can document that. Real wages have been stagnant for 30 years. You know, bumping up and down, but stop kidding ourselves that wages are going to dramatically improve in the near future. That's what one key point for progressive politics. And this means that the precariat is unique in another respect. It's the first class to be exploited off workplaces as well as in place workplaces, outside labour time as well as inside, and suffers from what I call precariatized mind. You never know what's the best use of your time. You don't know because you cannot decide. You can't work out the probabilities. And consequently, the precariat is living on the edge of unsustainable debt. One error, one mistake, right? Millions of people are being exploited by mechanisms of debt. And I have a whole chapter in this new book, how it's deliberate. It's not an incidental feature. It is a deliberate function. They want us to be in debt. Don't think that they would like to help you get out of debt. No, they want you to be in debt. It's a reality. And that leads to the final point about the definition, which is that if you're in the precariat, you're what historians call denizens. A denizen is a medieval concept which referred to people who went into a town and they were given a more limited range of rights than the citizens of the town. But this is the first time in history when your citizens, a part of your citizens, are in the process of losing le droit acquis. They're losing civil rights, cultural rights, political rights, social rights, economic rights. You can document that. It's a phenomenon that has enormous implications for some of you people in the law field because it's a reality, strong reality. So it leads to the key aspect of the precariat. Most people start talking about precarious work, precarious labour. Rubbish. The key point about the precariat is you are a supplicant. The original etymological root of precariousness, the Latin origin, is to beg by prayer. You don't have rights. You have to ask for favours. Whether it be a bureaucrat, a policy person, please give me something. You're a beggar. Now, this is the precariat, and it's getting very angry. It's anomic, it's alienated, it's anxious, it's getting angry. But at the moment it's split into three factions. The first faction consists of what I call atavists, falling out of all working class communities, families and traditions. They don't have a lot of education in this part of the precariat. So they listen to the populist neo-fascists, and the Brexiteers, and the Donald Trump, and the Marine Le Pen next year, and the AfD in Germany, etc. They're going in that direction. It's dangerous. I don't need to tell you that. The second part of the precariat is what I call the nostalgics. These are the refugees, the migrants, the Roma, the minorities, the disabled, who don't have a present, they don't have a home. They don't have any sense of belonging. That's a very dangerous in a different way. The third part of the precariat are the people, I call them progressives, but they come out of university, they don't have a future. They were promised a future when they went to university. They were promised a career, a sense of good society, and they're coming out with debt and no future. They're getting angry, but they're looking for a new progressive politics, and that's what this book is an attempt to go into. Now, the next point, which is central to this new book, is that what's happened in the last 30 years is that the rhetoric of neoliberalism, the rhetoric of our utilitarian politicians in the centre-left, centre-right, has been that they're constructing a free market economy. You'll hear every politician saying it's a free market economy. My contention in this book is that this, what they've created, is the most unfree market economy ever created. That's a strong statement. And I'll just give you some of the key points about it. That first thing is that we've been captured by an intellectual property rights regime. It's very key to my whole arguments about a need for a new income distribution system that we must understand that rentier capitalism has been growing stronger and stronger. And more of the total income being generated is going in forms of rent, not profits for production of goods and services or for doing hard work and labour, but owning property of various sorts and being able to receive enormous rental values. Dominic Ames in 1936 predicted that during the course of the 20th century, the rentier would experience euthanasia because he thought that capital would become so broad and common that the opportunity for monopolistic practices and positional capture of rent would decline. He did not foresee the things that I'm going into in the book, and particularly he did not see the neoliberal agenda, which has built an architecture of institutions internationally and nationally, which is guaranteeing the rentiers earn more and more. When I first went to Geneva, the UN was the biggest building in the International Labour Organization, and there was a little body down the road, very little place. We all used to laugh at it because it had a name that sounded like a detergent. It was Wipo. Wipo. We had a great laugh, especially after a beer or two, about Wipo. Where is Wipo? Today, if you go to Geneva, in the centre of Geneva, the two dominant buildings are the Refugee Agency and WIPO. WIPO has a huge conference centre that stretches out into the middle, sort of juts out arrogantly in its conceit. WIPO is the World Intellectual Property Organization. And in 1995, they passed TRIPS. Again, one of those lovely acronyms that you can play around with. Have a trip in a WIPO, it's, you can go places. The TRIPS is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property. And what that did was established a global system of intellectual property rights, which have become enormously significant. To start with, patents became a guarantee of 20 years monopoly income for anybody who's got a patent. Every country in the WTO, every country in effect, signs up to TRIPS. So they guarantee everybody who has a patent 20 years, and in some cases, in pharmaceuticals and a few other sectors, a further 20 years they can get. This is a monopoly income which is taking the market out of it. In other words, nobody can compete on those products. And of course, the number of patents in the last decade has tripled. Number of filings. There are now, in the stock of patents that are in force, is over 10 million patents globally. They estimate that the value of the stock of patents, we've got estimates and I've got some in the book, but at the moment it could be about $16 trillion. That's the value of the patent. So the patents are guaranteeing a rental income if you have a patent. And what has been happening is that major multinational corporations have become patent hoovers. They go around hoovering up the patents. So if you get a patent for a little invention and think you're going really well, they'll come along and offer you £1 million and you'll say, shit, that's good. And buy a few dinners on that. And you take it. But they're buying up thousands of patents and they string them together and they turn it into billions. And that's what's happening. Okay? The irony is that most patents are the result of publicly funded research. So you pay to undercut their risks, to save them taking any risk in their expenditure, and then they walk away and make billions in some cases. Right? So it is rental income, and the argument that patents are a return to risk is bullshit, excuse me. It isn't. Most patents are not even used. They are taken out as a defensive mechanism to stop competition. And most patents that I've seen are not about inventions. Ironically, the World Wide Web is one of the big inventions of our time, and that wasn't patented, and that's why it's been so broadly important. So here is one source of rental income, and I go into the statistics, so I won't bore you with them, but it's enormously influential. In addition, you have copyright. Now, globally, the copyright system guarantees the owner of a copyright, and it's usually the publisher, not the writer, and etc., is guaranteed an income for life plus 70 years. Now, I don't know what you're going to do with the money, but, hell, maybe having good shops, but that's the reality. In some countries, it's got up to 95. So when politicians say we mustn't give something for nothing to people claiming benefits, I've got Anglo-Saxon words for that. Because this system guarantees a lot of people a lot of some things for nothing. All right? Then you go into trademarks and brands. Most of the big corporations, their biggest value are brands. Not the goods they sell, but the brands, which operate as barriers to entry and provide rental income. So you have a system here where most of the new products and services around the world are trapped by intellectual property. There's no free market. And anybody who says it is either an idiot or something worse. That's the first source of rental income. And I go through that. It's a boring chapter in some respects because it's all about the architecture and the institution. One little extra thing for your lawyers. What they've introduced is the ISDS. Okay? Investor State Dispute Settlement. Some of you I can see know about this. But essentially what it is integrated into the 3,000 plus trade and investment agreements that exist, a web around the world, which guarantees property rights. And it does so by a very distinctive, you might think, democratic phenomenon, which is a corporation can sue a government if the government makes any policy change that, in the view of the corporation, threatens their future profits. Imagine that. But then they get to appoint the judge. There are 3 judges, they're all corporate lawyers. The corporation appoints one, the government appoints the second. If the corporation doesn't like the third that's suggested, then the president of the World Bank, who's an American always, gets to appoint. You will be incredibly surprised that the United States hasn't lost any cases. I don't know why that should be, but it's one of those things, right? So this is the most undemocratic process. They've wheedled hundreds of millions of dollars from developing countries through this process. Now imagine you as a citizen having the right to sue your government if you think they've introduced a policy which affects your future income. We could make a lot of money. Huh? But that's what they do for the corporations. Now, if you think this is a free market system, you need to take up some other subject. But that's the reality. Now, the second part of rentier capitalism, and let's look at time, the second aspect of rentier capitalism is that the dirty secret of our age is the subsidies state. They talk about cutting benefits, they talk about not being able to afford a basic income, they talk about all these things. And yet they built an edifice of subsidies, take 4 forms that I discussed in the chapter. They're worth hundreds of millions of pounds in this country, billions and billions in the United States, and every country, about 5–6% of GDP goes in subsidies. A feature of these subsidies is they're mostly regressive. In other words, they go to richer groups and richer individuals. They distort markets. Any subsidy distorts in some sense. and they're inefficient and hugely expensive, and they're part of the corrosion and corruption of democracy that Chapter 7 is about. It includes the tax breaks, the differentiation of taxes, the deliberate beggar-my-neighbour fiscal policy where you're lowering corporation taxes systematically, all countries, one after the other, to attract capital to your country. If you lower corporation tax, that leads to another phenomenon that's become a global thing, which is that people work it out that they pay more if they pay income tax than if they pay corporation tax, because corporation tax is down here, so they incorporate themselves. So there's been a huge growth of people who become corporations, so that they only pay corporation tax. It's a way of getting rental income, because you're not paying your income tax. It includes many other things, I won't go into that, but the subsidy state is hugely oriented to rentier capitalism. Then you come to the next chapter, which is about, I called it the splurge of debt. Now, I'm looking it up because there was one quotation I wanted to get. Oh no, I will not, I'll skip it. Essentially, debt has, as I said earlier, become an institutionalized mechanism. Every country of any significance in the world economy has an incredibly high ratio of debt to national income. Many countries well over 100%, some well over 200%. The interesting thing is, when the debt crisis and the financial crisis hit in 2007-2008, a particular paper was written in the United States by a banker, surprise, surprise, and his sidekick, saying that if there was high public debt, you slowed growth. So this allowed for austerity. And we have to cut public debt. So they wanted to cut benefits, cut benefits, cut benefits. At the same time lowering taxes, which creates a deficit. Actually, 3 years later, after these countries had used that paper, a friend of mine, as it happens, but it's now accepted, he wrote another paper pointing out that they were all wrong, they got their data points wrong, and there wasn't any such relationship. But of course the damage had been done by then. And then the IMF have come out and said, wait a minute, we looked at the figures, it's not public debt, it's private debt that is the key. And if you cut public debt, you shift it onto private people. So private debt has been going up, household debt, corporate debt, but particularly debt if you're in the Precariat, and that you are on that edge more and more. So debt has become this rent-sucking instrument that I go into in many respects in that chapter. And of course, it includes student debt. All right? Two things about student debt that you should really think about. One is that they've created a huge edifice of hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds or whatever of student debt. And what have they done? It's a wheeze, fantastic wheeze. It's called securitization. Okay? They're bundling the debts together and selling it to American multinational corporations, and the bundle of debt, your debt, becomes an asset for the corporation. And they can lend and borrow on the basis of holding that asset and making a lot of money out of people's debt. I mean, you know, it's quite clever. It's very simple. George Osborne sold to a company which I describe and go into. He sold it at a discount because he wanted to encourage them. And then it's come out that they are registered in a tax haven. So they don't pay any tax on their bloody rental income. Oh, excuse me, rental income. So the increase of debt goes into the student debt. New one is that property owners from around the world are buying up from public universities student accommodation, low-cost student accommodation, to make them into gentrified, high-cost rental, to make huge profits from what was a public piece of the commons. That's another piece of the puzzle. Now, I've just been on the BBC, and the producer, afterwards rather than before, he asked me, what's your favourite chapter in the book? He seemed to like the book, I hope he did. And I said, the plunder of the commons. If any of you read it, I hope it means something to you as much as it does to me. Because it's one of the untold parts of this. What's been happening is systematically privatizing and commercializing the commons. Chipping away not just on land, not just underneath the land, not just the spaces, but the intellectual commons, the cultural commons, the social commons that I described. And there should be an anger. If there isn't, I failed in writing the chapter. Because basically what they're doing is converting our heritage that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years into a rent extraction device for an elite and a plutocracy. And they say we can't pay benefits for the disabled. But they're selling it off, creating a new rentier class. I've just been reading about the Garden Bridge over the Thames. I mean, I've always thought the Thames was part of our heritage, that it belonged to us as society. Instead of which I find that the government has been given huge guarantees and subsidy to a private bunch of whatever. Sorry, I must keep polite. But it's part of the selling off of the commons. Now, I want to end that part of the story because it leads to the final part. The final line of rentier capitalism is that work is the best route out of poverty. I dare say some of you have heard that somewhere. It's a lie. More and more people in the Precariat and falling into it, however hard they work, they will not escape poverty. And this is a reality that cannot really be denied. And it's shown by the breakdown of the income distribution system. A few points on that. It used to be, when I was a student at Cambridge, that when productivity went up, wages went up. Now, when productivity goes up, wages go down. We call it the opening of the jaws of the snake. Second, it used to be that when profits went up, wages went up. No longer. No longer. It used to be that when employment went up, wages went up. It was basic, 101 economics. No longer. Average wages often go down. And it's not just in this country or the US or anywhere. And the next one, which really puzzled poor old George Osborne. Don't you feel sorry for him? Yeah, poor old George. When employment goes up, it used to be that tax revenue from employment went up too. Sort of thing that's obvious. Except that when he found that employment was rising, tax revenue from employment was going down. Never happened before. Okay? And that's because the new forms of jobs taking place aren't paying decent wages. So they're not getting into the tax-paying bracket. Now we have a situation where the system has broken down. The share of income going to capital is shooting up. The share going to labour is shooting down. That's a global phenomenon. But more interesting than that, because I think a lot of people know that, is that the share within capital going to the top is going up. And within the labour share, the share going to the top is going up. So you have a situation where platform capitalism is emerging. I've got a whole chapter on that, where, as you very nicely put it, you obviously looked at that chapter, essentially what is happening is that crowd labour is emerging as the new form of labour relationship. It's forecast by reputable people inside the industry that within the next 5 years, 1 in every 3 labour transactions will be done online. You won't have a standard employment relationship or any other sort of employment relationship. It will be done online by taskers. All this debate about whether Uber drivers should be employees or self-employed will look ridiculous. I've just been giving a lecture in San Francisco where the Uber chief executive was in the audience. I think he was rather pleased when I got to this bit. But the reality is that crowd labour, we have no contract laws that protect people in doing crowd labour. It's driving down the wage rates to super exploited levels, particularly Amazon Turk, and that's part of the platform capitalism. And it's being manipulated by venture capital. Venture capital does not want these companies to go public. Why? Because they're making operational losses, huge operational losses, and the venture capitalists that put in the money drawn up agreements with these platform capitalists that they don't go public or they pay the venture capitalists compensation. Because if they went public and they're making, like Uber is $100 million loss every quarter, then the shares would plunge, right? So they're not making any profit. Why not? Because they are deliberately undercutting their competitors. It's a form of social dumping. And they go into a city, quite a lot of them, not just Uber, they go into a city, deliberately underpriced, but pay their drivers or their whatever might be, their taskers, a bonus so that they're making more. But in fact, what is happening is they're underselling the product, the service. Okay? This is a form of rentierism, drives out through unfair competition. But you have to realize that all these platforms are labour brokers. They're old-style labour brokers. Because they're making 20% or 30% on every transaction. It's quite a good deal if you think about it, just for having an app. So this part has got to be integrated into labour law, work rights, and all of these things, and I've got some suggestions. I'll just end on my presentation. I've spoken too long, I apologise. But the final 2 chapters. One, each time I read it myself, I shouldn't do that, gets me just so angry that I have to stop reading it. It's the corruption of our democracy by the financiers, by the plutocrats, by the oligarchs, by the Rupert Murdochs. Nobody's won an election in this country since 1974 without the explicit support of Rupert Murdoch. Fact. When he was asked why did he support Brexit, when Theresa May, she rushed across to New York, the first thing she did when being elected Prime Minister, chosen, not elected, chosen Prime Minister, she rushed across to New York, spoke an hour in the United Nations, spent 4 hours with Rupert Murdoch. You know, that tells you where power lies. He was asked, why did you support Brexit? Now, I think he must be getting gaga or something, or so conceited. His answer was, why? Because when I go to Downing Street, they do what I tell them to do. When I go to Brussels, they ignore me. Oh, sorry, Rupert. But of course, that corruption of our democracy goes to the point where our elections are run by foreign mercenaries. Both sides of the Brexit campaign were run by foreigners, with foreign money, by Americans and Australians, not by Europeans or British people. We should be angry about that. The last general election, all 3 main parties were run by foreign PR companies. We should be angry about that. Our central bank is run by an ex-Goldman Sachs man from Canada. Can you imagine the US Federal Reserve appointing a foreigner to run their monetary policy? Seriously. But Goldman Sachsism, as I described, is everywhere. That leads to the final chapter, And the final chapter is about the need for revolt and how it's going to come. Because this is unsustainable. We have to revolt. Our democracy is a phony. The inequalities and insecurities are becoming uglier and uglier. And we have to revolt in some way. Sorry. Because they're not going to change without pressure. And the real story is, how do we achieve Keynes's dream? Keynes's dream of the euthanasia of the rentier. That's the challenge we have in front, because morally and economically they cannot defend rentier capitalism. It doesn't accord with their own stated principles. It isn't related to growth or economic performance. It's rewarding oligarchs and elites. It's unjustified. And a new income distribution system will have to achieve that euthanasia by understanding that we need mechanisms to provide economic security for people. Without that, we cannot be expected to be good citizens. We cannot. And we need to realize, how do we redistribute that rental income? How do we capture that rental income to create some sort of sovereign wealth fund, a democratically controlled sovereign wealth fund that enables us to be doing what Thomas Paine dreamed of in 1796. A return to the commons, a social wealth, a social dividend model. It's feasible because you can develop these sovereign wealth funds, and Alaska and Norway have done so. It's a good way of building up a basic income as the anchor of your system, and then saying, okay, we can develop from that basis. We should not be allowed to be falling into the trap that the libertarians and some others want us to fall into a trap. We can't afford a basic income because you'd have to replace this, that, and the other. We've got to realize that it's as a necessary response to rentier capitalism. It's a different way of looking at it, but I think we will make more progress. I'll end on that point by acknowledging the presence here of Malcolm Torrey, not only a friend of mine, good friend. He's also the director of the Citizens Income Trust, which is basically the British version of our network promoting basic income. Anybody can join, and it's gaining a lot of members, a lot of support. And Malcolm and his colleagues are doing some fantastic work, so I'm pleased to see him here this evening. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.